Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 10th event in Public Funds Public Schools webinar series. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm the Director of Public Funds Public Schools. PFPS is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the SPLC Action Fund, dedicated to ensuring that public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen our public schools. You can visit our website, pfps.org, and sign up for updates on our contact page. Today, we are delighted to host Charles Siler, Nancy Abudu, and Donald Cohen. We'll meet all three in a moment for a webinar on vouchers, voter suppression, and other vices, the effort to undermine democracy and the public good. Please use the Q&A feature to submit questions for the panel, and they'll get to those in the second half of the program. We'll also record the webinar and post it on our website. Our moderator, Donald Cohen, is the Executive Director of In the Public Interest, a national nonprofit research and policy organization that studies and advocates for public goods and institutions. He is the author of a forthcoming book, The Privatization of Everything: How the Plunder of Public Goods Transformed America and How We Can Fight Back. Donald, please take it away.
So I think I'm on. Thanks, Jessica. And I'm going to give a big picture talk about privatization of public goods and condense that 300-page book into 7 minutes or so. So you'll have to buy the book to get the full story. So I'm going to talk about, specifically talking about the privatization of public goods. So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions. First, what do I mean by public goods? This is not, if any of you are economists, this is not the economist definition of it, formal definition. But fundamentally, it's, at the simplest, it's the things that we can only do if we do them together. Like cleaning the air, like ensuring every person has health care, like ensuring every child has education, and much more. And none of those things depending on whether you can pay for them or not. And that's sort of a very colloquial definition. The second, I want to define tell you how we define privatization, because it's a broader definition. I define privatization as private power over public goods, and I'll describe that a little bit more detail in a little bit. But what I see privatization at the core, at its core is really a part of a wholesale attack on government that's been going on for 50 years. And part of that, central to that attack, is a multi-sided effort to undermine the public goods and common purpose, which means and includes the undermining of public education, of public health, of democracy, of knowledge, of science, of economic security, and much more. So, big picture stuff. So I'm gonna go through like it's always a who are the drivers of privatization. First, and this includes, so it includes outsourcing, it includes all sorts of stuff, and I'll describe that in a second. Actually, no, let me do that now. I'm going to change my order. So let me talk about the 5 ways that control is gotten of private goods. First is contracting out public services. We know water systems, school custodians, prisons, a lot more. We know about that. The second is austerity. If you reduce public funding for fundamental services that weaken those services, then people are left to fend for themselves in the market. So that's, they'll become a private good. Third, creating parallel systems like vouchers that bleed public systems. Fourth is deregulation or failing to enforce basic regulations and safeguards. If a polluter in a low-income community, if a business is polluting in a low-income community and that's not adequately regulated and monitored, then that business or whoever it is has control over people's lives at some level, their health. And then finally, voter suppression and other ways to limit people's ability to express their democratic voice. So those are, as I described, private control over public goods. Those are the different mechanisms that I see. Then the question is who? Who are we talking about? Who are the drivers of privatization at this level? First and foremost, it is a corporate grab for cash. Other than in the pandemic, the governments in America spend about $7 trillion a year and annually. And so there are corporations that, want in on the $750 billion in public education, want in our in monitoring the health in our food system, our water system, sort of all of the above, every type of public service. There are large corporations, some of them are global, that are thinking about how to, tap into it with contracts. The second group is really the political class. It's conservative politicians who think they get elected because they want to privatize, deregulate, cut taxes, take on unions, and a variety of things. They're really driving privatization at lots of levels. Next would be social conservatives, and religious conservatives who oppose government, when convenient for many reasons. And these are all overlapping, of course. And then finally, there are, true believers. There are ideological conservatives who believe, in a different way to organize society. And, to be simple, is they want to redefine our relationship with government so that instead of being citizens with rights and responsibilities, we're individual consumers of public services where you get what you pay for, instead of equal access to public, universal equal access to public goods and the things that matter to us all. So those, in my view, are sort of the drivers. So now I want to go through, I always feel a little hesitant to do this. I am putting so much content in a very short period of time because I could go through each one of these points and give illustrations. So I want to talk about two of their main arguments. First is that private companies can do it cheaper, better, faster. We hear it all the time, over and over again. When you outsource a prison or a water system or all sorts of things. But what happens is the real experience is quite different. So here's a few things that happen that kind of counteract, that show that that's really not that true all the time. One is that fundamentally funds are deserved when you're out. So I was talking about outsourcing now to make it simple. Let's say you're privatizing a prison. We are diverting funds from the service, whether it's water or a prison or schools or what have you. We're diverting funds from that service to other things that are legitimate in business terms: profit, advertising, debt relief, executive salaries. So all that money is no longer being spent on the service. It's really important to understand. Second is contractors will often then underbid, to get if it's a competitive process, so they cut corners, quality goes down, and then cost savings turn into cost overruns. These are patterns, because we see this all over the country. Next, good jobs with living wages get replaced by lower wage jobs with fewer or no benefits. It happens quite frequently. And finally, there's other things, but finally we lose the right to know details and really important information about public services. We lose transparency when things go from public to private control. So that's the first argument: cheaper, better, faster, and we can go through lots of examples how that just has not turned out to be true in many, many places. The second is maybe a little bit more ideological, but also not, is they say that markets really are a better mechanism to take care of our needs, not government. So I'll give an example that'll resonate with this group. So in the 50s, some of you may know this, conservative economist Milton Friedman saw that privatization was as a solution to, his quote, the trend towards collectivism, unquote. This was during the Cold War. So he proposed a market-based approach, give parents vouchers so they could choose pick a school of their choice. But there was already so that's, put it in the marketplace so that people can, parents and families could compete. But what was also true in that period of time is that there was already a quote, school choice movement in segregated states that, in the wake of Brown versus public education, and vouchers became a central part of the segregationist strategy. So turning it into a market good rather than a public good helped them do that. So now I'm going to finish with a couple of examples of what I think is really at stake and connected to the larger theme that we're talking about. I believe that what privatization is most fundamentally, its biggest threat is it is a fundamental assault on democracy. And I'm going to give two just examples to illustrate. One is, some of you may know, and some of you know me, have heard me tell this story. Chicago parking meters. Chicago sold its parking meters in 2009 for 75 years to a consortium of Wall Street and a parking company. And what they learned, and they made the deal, it was a terrible deal. What they learned is that after the deal was done, is that if the city now wants to do things to increase transit use and decrease car use or change housing policy. If they want to eliminate spots, they have to buy them back. And that puts a brake on policymakers on what they can and will and won't do. The second example, just real quick to finish up, is private prisons. Private prisons in the country, if you look at their contracts, have bed guarantees in them. Pay or, 80, 90, and 100%, pay or not. And if you look at what they say in their SEC filings, they say the demand for our facilities could be adversely affected by relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing, or through the decriminalization of certain activities, for example, drugs. So it's in their economic interest for people to be in prison. It's not in our interest to be in prison. So they have bed guarantees in their contracts that lock in those interests. So I just finished by saying, just sort of summarizing, I think this is really about power. It's about democratic power over the things that matter to us all. It's about who has that power, how they got it, how they use it. And then, to the work that I do, it's how we get it back and make sure we have it. I'm going to finish there. Hopefully I've done well with time. Again, questions in the Q&A. So I am now going to introduce Charles, who is currently in Croatia. He's calling from Croatia. He is not Croatian. You read his bio in the chat box. I think he's an expert on these issues. He's a pro-public education advocate. And most interestingly, if you noticed, he kind of comes from the conservative intellectual infrastructure. So Nicole just put it in the chat box. So Charles, take it away.
Hey, thanks so much, David. And honestly, I just want to say, like, as an Arizonan, watching the Supreme Court ruling today, like, I'm really interested to hear what Nancy has to say. So I'm kind of looking forward to wrapping up my piece so that we can hear from her. I think it's interesting that you touched on private prisons and the bed guarantees, because could you imagine like applying that kind of like guaranteed funding stream to public schools in the wake of privatization? Like, I don't think that many of us could imagine that. But really, one thing that I think we should just start off with is just like looking at what school choice is. And I think that one of the biggest problems that people fighting privatization and the dismantling of our public institutions and public schools is that they look at a lot of these issues kind of in somewhat of a silo and kind of separated from each other. And so I think that it's really important that people understand that school privatization is just one element of a larger political assault on our community institutions. And if you're interested in protecting voting rights and big labor, like labor unions and organizing and even rights to protest and so much more, it's critical to pay attention to school privatization. And it's also critical for people fighting and advocating for public schools to look at these other issues, especially when it comes to voting rights. There's a huge degree of importance and connection between the two. First thing I think is important as someone who comes from this world of I was actually a true believer in privatization, especially in the academic realm, and thinking that using market forces, we could create a better system for students and for families, better infrastructure for students. But once you're there, if you have any kind of sincerity about yourself and you start to look at the actual research that's done on the outcomes of these things, it doesn't improve student outcomes at all. And it has huge detriments on communities as well as marginalized groups and people who don't have the same access to resources. So one thing I think that would be great is just to identify kind of this end goal of school privatization. And really, I think that a lot of people who look at school privatization see vouchers, they see charter schools, and they think, okay, like they just want to have universal vouchers. They just want to privatize like X school or whatever. But no, they don't want any public funds being spent on education whatsoever. Like that is, it might sound extreme, and maybe not every individual in the privatization realm would advocate that far, but for the people driving this agenda, That is their goal. They want it to look like a private higher ed system. I mean, where you have student loans, you have entirely privatized education systems, and then people determine how important and how valuable K through 12 education is to themselves by spending money on it, whether that means putting themselves into debt or whatever it is that they need to do to cover those expenses, and then alleviating that sort of tax draw. But beyond that, that's just their goal in the school privatization realm. When we're talking about like the end goal of school privatization advocates and the people really pushing this, and I'm talking about like the Bradley Foundation, I'm talking about Betsy DeVos's AFC, I'm talking about like all the different groups out there, is really it's driving us towards a plutocracy. What they want is they want to have individual consumers rather than citizens. I mean, when you think about private property and privatization itself, they're predicated on the use of violence to exclude people. Because if you can't keep people out of something, then it's not actually private. And so violent exclusion is really the foundation for privatization. And that's what's so great about public institutions, is that they're designed to focus on inclusion. Now, obviously, we can look at history and see that they're not perfect at that because people aren't perfect, and neither are institutions. So that's why I think that you can't look at any of these things in a vacuum. We have to address so many different social issues all at the same time to improve them all together. So, but one of the things that I think is also interesting is to look at the other big issues. You kind of I've touched on them quickly, but privatizers, they're anti-voting and direct democracy. Anytime there are systems of direct democracy in states, they seek to curtail those things. And I'm sure that Nancy can get much deeper into that than I can. It's definitely not my field of expertise, but also the anti-organized labor. That's why like the Janus case was so huge. It was actually taking on teachers unions, and a big part of the charter movement is just to help undermine strong teachers unions. But even beyond that, it's also about undermining community organization. You have PTOs, you have local school boards that set policies and give people power through working collectively. And that's what all these things have in common, is they are sources of collective power from individuals. So it's a way we get together that we can actually stand up to this sort of movement towards plutocracy. But when these privatizers are looking to like implement their policies, they're really willing to kind of work with anybody, despite what rhetoric they might have about voluntary liberty, this or that. I mean, we've seen them work with white supremacists, especially in the school choice movement, as was just alluded to by Donald a moment ago, with the segregationists. We've seen the monetarists in the Chicago school, so Milton Friedman's folks and others working with military dictatorships, from the Pinochet regime in Chile to now there's groups working with the Honduran government after their military coup down there to form these like sort of independent, autonomous economic development zones, despite what the local population may be interested in. So like they really will work with anybody, and oftentimes that means Republicans like that are like really into social conservatism and limiting liberties of women and different groups of people. And some of the ways that they actually like move the needle with people's by inflaming like white discomfort. And they've done it a number of times, whether that's through raising issues with teaching of evolution in schools or the integration of schools. So we saw it with Common Core. We've seen flare-ups about teaching of comprehensive sex ed, and we're seeing it now with this whole issue of critical race theory and things in school. But once they've got the people inflamed and they're moving forward with their processes, they're looking to lock these things in through constitutional manipulation, through manipulating different legal processes to keep people from being able to have an organized voice. But fortunately, there are some ways that they can be stopped. One of the best things that we can do is just organize in our communities, like the broad base of people. Even when I worked on the other side, like looking at polling, people don't support privatization on the whole. They really have to be pushed in that direction. So the good news is most people, your neighbors, even if they sound like they're riled up about something, they're generally pro-public institutions. Also, coordination across issues for progressive advocacy groups would be fantastic. Specialization is really great, but all of you need each other. The privatizers, they're definitely finding ways to coordinate and amplify each other. So as we move forward, I think we can answer some questions that people may have about some of that stuff. But
Awesome. Thank you, Charles. So before I introduce Nancy, I just want to remind folks to, if you have questions, put them in the, enter them in the Q&A. Feel free to repeat something that you already put in that, in your form, all that, just whatever you want. So let me introduce Nancy Abudu. She's the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center's Interim Strategic Litigation Director, and she leads their work on voting rights. Nancy.
Thank you, Donald. And I really want to thank Jessica and the organizers of this webinar, in part for just including me and being able to hear from Donald and Charles in terms of the unfortunate but very terrifying landscape that we find ourselves in when it comes to the encroachment of privatization in so many areas, but in the area of education perhaps being one of the most concerning. I also want to appreciate or thank the organizers for recognizing and really pushing the tie between privatization and voting rights, and in particular voter suppression, because indeed you all, or Donald and Charles, have identified the problem. Voting rights for many, it could be viewed as one of the strategies or tactics to reach a solution. And yet, unfortunately, I'm going to add to some of the doom in terms of how those who are proponents of privatization have developed their strategic plan very holistically. Meaning not only have they identified the proponents and the actors in the acts, but they've also attacked the methods through which we as opponents of this movement could actually see some gains. And in my realm of work, which involves voting rights, I think there are a couple of methods that historically have been successful and for sure right now are under attack. One of those methods is the use of ballot initiatives. There are about 26 states in our country that allow for the voters to override the policies of their state legislators so that they can enact directly through direct democracy the types of policies that best serve citizens, that best serve the communities. And as Charles just mentioned, we see that coming through in some of the polling, which shows that the majority of people do not support privatization, that they want to continue funding public education and making those institutions stronger. And so what we find is that when citizens have tried to use the ballot initiative process in some of the states where SPLC concentrates its work, there's been a backlash. And I can share two examples with you. One of them involves Florida, where a couple of years ago, voters passed an initiative to allow people to get their voting rights restored, those with criminal convictions, to get their voting rights restored upon completion of sentence. And then we had proposals after that success, where we had almost 65% of voters voting in favor of this initiative. You then had proposals by the legislature to increase the threshold by which a ballot initiative could be passed. So as where before it was about 64%, now they want to raise it to 66%, which is right above what was able to be achieved through the Florida ballot initiative. We've also seen state courts try to override the ballot initiative process, most recently in Mississippi, where that state Supreme Court used a very unnecessary technicality in the law to completely dismantle the citizens of that state's efforts to enact more progressive policies. And we know for sure Mississippi is another state that is in dire need of attention and support when it comes to strengthening the public education institutions there. Another strategy, which some would say is the beginning, is get out the vote efforts. When you're going to your neighborhood public grocery store, or you're going to a festival and you see people out asking you if you're registered, wanting to make sure that you understand the issues that are on the ballot. And yet now we're seeing a lot of regressive bills that would make those kinds of efforts difficult. Georgia, for example, passed the bill, Senate Bill 202, that would make it more difficult for people to cast a ballot through Dropbox, that condenses the times that people can vote outside of election day. And that also makes it very difficult for voters to even get assistance in understanding their ballot and being able to cast it. And then, of course, Florida has also passed a regressive law that makes it more difficult for third-party voter registration organizations to engage in their work, and only increases the criminal penalties associated with their outreach that for sure in communities of color has been critical for purposes of making sure that people are actively engaged, indeed are registering and voting. In some ways, these third-party registration groups are doing the work of the state, but because they have been successful at it, now we have, again, state legislators coming and attacking them. And then, as Charles made reference to, we got a very unfortunate decision from the US Supreme Court today involving a challenge to 2 Arizona voting laws. One that would automatically reject any ballot and the entire ballot of any voter who mistakenly voted in the wrong precinct. And to clarify, you often have voters who are voting in the correct county, and therefore almost every single election for which they're voting would count regardless. But because they're voting in the wrong particular precinct in their county, the Supreme Court has now said that it is absolutely constitutional to throw out that entire vote, which means that even the statewide elections for which those voters cast their ballot don't even count. I think another issue that we're seeing just in terms of the Supreme Court's ruling is really an erosion of the constitutional protections as well as the statutory protections that even Congress recognized, because we are not in a post-racial society. We are not in an environment or a culture where we can rely on our state legislators to do the right thing by our children, especially if they are Black and brown. And unfortunately, the Supreme Court's decision today only makes those kinds of regressive policies easier to enact. And then finally, I'll say in terms of a strategy that I hope people become more engaged in is redistricting. We are wrapping up, hopefully soon, the process that the Census Bureau engaged in to count all citizens, or to count all individuals, and to make sure that those who are eligible to vote actually have the political strength to elect their candidates of choice. A lot of folks focus on statewide offices, congressional offices, but as this webinar and discussion today reveals, it's really the local level elections that can often impact people's lives the most. And for our purposes today, I would emphasize the importance of really weighing in on school board election, city council, and county commission elections, because those are the governing bodies that are making these kinds of policies that we're talking about. And they are also the ones who can reverse course and get us back on track in terms of expanding education and making sure that it's not just adequate, but it's excellent, that every child who is coming out of our public education system has the educational background that they need to be successful in life. And then finally, I'll say that despite the blow we got in the Supreme Court today, we continue to define and redefine our victories. And what we know for sure is that we do have to continue the battle to oppose these kinds of regressive actions, laws, behavior, and that we have to not only look for the bigger victories, but we really have to embrace the smaller ones. I think in part because we need to be able to show that we are able to make wins and adopt a strategy that recognizes that it takes time and that it's piecemeal, pretty much like what we're seeing from our opponents. So with that, I'll end my comments and really look forward to the Q&A as well. Thank you.
That was fantastic. And you ended before time. So you did much better than us. So let me We're going to go right to questions. There's some going into the question box. We have some questions sort of submitted in advance. So I'm going to kick us off, and we'll do our best to get through as many as possible. So the people who answer, which means Charles and Nancy, do your best at keeping them, tight. Complete, accurate, but, don't go overboard. So we're in a conversation about race today like we haven't been in a long time. Unfortunately, there's all this whole effort around critical race theory is really, I believe, really driven to undermine public education in deep ways and other things, and democracy and other things. So I think what people want to, what the question is, and I think what it'd be helpful to talk about a little bit is, how do we push back? How do we not get caught in the debate that they want to have on something called critical race theory, which isn't really what this is about? Nobody really knows what critical race theory is as a theoretical construct, but it's it's a racial dog whistle or bullhorn. So what are your thoughts on how to not get caught and push back and redirect the conversation about race in the right way? Let me start with you, Nancy, because it looked like you had answers, and then I'll go to Charles.
No, I'm just making notes. There's so much here.
Yeah.
But one, I just have to highlight SPLC's, both our intelligence project that really talks about the issues of hate groups and white supremacists and the information and mostly disinformation that they're putting out there, as well as our Learning for Justice program, which is the counter to that kind of behavior. And also talking about what does critical race theory mean? So I think your initial comment, Donald, about that, we're using this term critical race theory, but most people don't even understand what it means. And also that phrase in and of itself doesn't fully encapsulate the education that's necessary in order for people, especially our younger generations, to understand why our social, economic, cultural conditions are what they are today. So I think that number one, we need to think carefully about what is the language we want to adopt and how do we control the narrative and the message, because this is what is happening. We put stuff out there, we have some gains, and then they completely mischaracterize what it is we're trying to achieve, which helps to push their agenda forward in terms of discounting and discrediting our work. So I think that's my initial answer, that we need to take control of the language, take control of the narrative, and also think outside the box. Of course, the school, the classroom is the ideal place for that kind of education to happen. And I don't think we should give up on making sure that it does. But I think that this is where technology and other tools of education that younger folks are already on top of, probably better than we are. So I think we need to also take advantage of those options as well.
Charles, you want to weigh in?
No, absolutely. I think she covered things fantastically. The only couple things I would even add to that is that, the education point is critical because, one, I think we should educate ourselves that it's not really that many people all up in arms about this issue. A lot of it is kind of a manufactured crisis to begin with. It's just being leveraged. And so I think that how you respond to it depends a little bit on the audience. And that's not to say that this manufactured crisis can't have dangerous outcomes. It absolutely does, and has impacted the ways that laws, there's been a ton of laws passed through a number of states already this year in response to the sort of astroturfed fire of CRT. But for parents in these districts that are confused, I think that one, it's very difficult to feel sympathetic to people who are getting so upset about an accurate education of racial issues in our country potentially being discussed in school. But there is a degree of life is busy. Parents don't always feel like they know what's actually being taught in schools. And so helping address some of that directly by educating them about what schools are actually doing. Most people love their teachers, they love their own public schools already. And so a lot of these things are they're more of an idea of a larger national culture war that they think is kind of going on. And if you can localize these things for them and help them see that hey, your school is teaching history, like effectively. And it's, I think that you can mitigate some of this. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still like complex like issues of racism and bigotry even in those protests. But if you want to address that, I think that that's probably the most direct way that you could hope to even achieve something with those people.
Great. And now just one person who puts a response in the questions, I'll just say, Jesse, I can't read his last name. He says, we need to stop using the term critical race theory. It should just be American history. So I'll just leave that. So I'm going to move to the next question. Someone submitted a question in advance that's long. I'm going to shorten the question, so hopefully I'll get it right. And I'm going to read it, but I understand your argument that organizations supporting vouchers are, in our view, undermining democracy. Therefore, do you believe that a parent who chooses to use a voucher for their child's education is undermining democracy? Are parents complicit in undermining public education? Charles, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I just want to kind of note that that question kind of conflates two things that aren't equal. One is saying that like we have a view that privatization advocates are destroying democracy, and then asks if we think that privatization utilizing parents are destroying democracy. And I think it's important to separate out the families who are often making the best individual choices that they can in whatever circumstances they find themselves, and not to equate families with very well-funded organizations of people who are systematically undermining public education and democracy. And so there's just a really big difference between those two things in my mind. And so I would say, do I feel like the parents are complicit? I think that families do what's best for them in the circumstances. And I think what's really unfortunate is that through by undermining other public institutions, other progressive ideas, that we've put so many families into desperate situations where they feel they don't have that many choices. And we've created a climate where privatizers can come in and sort of manipulate circumstances to push some of these families into these very difficult circumstances. I mean, most people who, I've talked to a number of families that utilize school choice options. It's difficult. They have to like research a number of different schools to find one. If they find one in their neighborhood, they have to figure out transportation. The school might not provide certain services. Like these aren't easy things for people to do. And so we're really inconveniencing these people by gutting their public schools. So I would definitely blame the institutions, not the families.
Nancy, anything to add relatively briefly?
Yeah, just the why. There are multiple options. And as Charles said, as a parent, it is a very difficult thing to identify an education environment that is going to be best for your child. And I think we have to acknowledge, and I believe everyone on this part of this, webinar acknowledges that there is not a one size fits all for every child. But we know that public education can be structured based on the community in a way that does achieve and meet the needs of the child. And if we do that, then the question becomes, why is a parent still feeling the need or desiring to use vouchers in order to get their child out of that institution? I think we also have to recognize, or not erase, maybe a little bit to the prior question about critical race theory, is why are we here? Why do we continue, even after the Brown v. Board School of Education have such levels of segregation, racial segregation in our school system? And why are the voucher programs being used in some ways to perpetuate that? So it's not, I would say, that a parent who decides to use a voucher, regardless of that parent's race or ethnicity, is perpetuating racism intentionally. But I think that some of those parents do need to pause and understand that their behavior, intentional or not, is doing just that.
That's great. Okay. Well, I'm getting questions now on 3 platforms: on the Q&A, on the chat, and texted. So I'm doing my best to keep us focused. So I'm going to move to the next question. So thinking proactively about public education, can either of you familiar with or have ideas about initiatives to promote, full funding of education, community connected services in schools, what a lot of people are calling community schools movement. Are either of you familiar with those efforts? Can you describe kind of, this is like the make public schools the best they should be for every child in America, and there's things that we can do really positively. Anybody want to comment on that? If you don't, I'll say a few things. Because you may
Yeah,
not
go ahead,
know.
Tom.
And I'll just say a couple of things on it. So there is this movement on community schools that bring together, that see the school as an anchor of its community, that recognizes that schools can't deal with every social issue. They can't deal with lack of, poverty, mental illness, lack of health care and all that, but they can connect those services in an institution that we all know because it's in our neighborhood. So that's one piece of this sort of community school movement, is to connect those services from other agencies. But the other piece of that is to figure out how to make the schools, one of the key ways of making the schools better is to engage the community, which means the parents, the teachers, the students, and the community. And how do we do that? How to identify what the community needs, what those students need. And so there really is a robust movement. There are inspirational stories happening around the country of people taking this approach. And so, we can send out stuff later on that. So let me go to the next question. Let me raise it up just a little bit to democracy, and then I'll come back down into something more narrow. So how do we promote democracy? I don't mean just voting rights. How do public schools, how can they promote democracy? Because I think we all probably agree our democracy isn't under threat, as you were saying, Nancy, in many ways, through voter suppression, through fake news, through misinformation, all that. Schools have to be part of the answer. So how do you see that? How do you see schools playing that role? Nancy, I'll start with you.
Well, for sure, in the voting rights context, and we focus a lot on civics education, wanting to make sure that students understand why do people get so excited every 4 years around the presidential election, and then how can we get them as excited about their school board election. So that's one thing, just trying to infuse that a little bit more. We've also tried to support efforts to allow for voter registration as early as possible. So if you're 17 and a half, or you're on the verge of becoming 18 during an election cycle, register and vote. For those who aren't eligible to register and vote right now, our Learning for Justice program initiated a program called, the Pledge. So we were encouraging students to encourage their family members and friends to register and vote and speak for them, for those students. So I think those are some concrete ways in which we can try to promote not only participation in our democracy, but for students to really understand, and parents, what it is they're participating in, how high the stakes are, and that yes, they do have power individually and collectively to make a difference.
Charles,
yeah, I would just also say, that's awesome. And I think the other thing is just being a part of a public school means that you're part of a larger community. Kids who go home to their neighborhood, from their neighborhood school, go home to a neighborhood full of their peers that they get to know and grow up with. And really, those are the kinds of relationships that communities are even built on as they grow up and age. And some of this individualization of each other, like sending kids in the same neighborhood to 17 different schools because of all the different choice options, means that they're kind of isolated when they come back to home at the end of the day. They don't know each other as well. The relationships are different. And so much of what we do when we're thinking about how we want to care for each other and just the empathy that we have for people in different circumstances comes from having people in our circle that have different situations. And so I think that privatization really actually poses a huge threat to just the thread and fabric of just the concept of society altogether.
I agree with that. If we don't interact with one another, we lose the ability to. All right, so I'm going to go to another question. I'm going to read it. It's a little long, so I don't want to get it wrong. So this comes from Dawn. I've been organizing grassroots public education advocates in Arizona for 5 years And what's clear at every level, from the local school board elections to statewide ballot measures, is that privatizers have infinite resources for advertising, busing in public puppet spokespeople, large candidate donations, and thus strong legislative, judicial access and influence. Is there anything public service advocates can do, have or can do, that effectively and sustainably rivals deep pockets? Charles, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, first off, I feel like I recognize that person's hat on, a great education advocate in Arizona, but it can be really daunting to try to take this on. And there's definitely been people fighting for public schools for a long time, but the privatizers have been at it in a very coordinated, like methodical, persistent way for a very long time. And so I'm not saying that the people are playing catch up. There's definitely been people fighting this for years, but there is, I think that people haven't had a strong awareness of just how far they want to take things. So there's it takes some time to actually even just catch up a little bit to where they're at. One of the things that I think that you have to do, and it's difficult because every state is different, but if we can't lock in things, like they're looking to use state constitutions, state judiciaries to kind of perpetuate their vision of society long after they're there to continue having influence. And I think that we need to use the mechanisms of government that are available to us to kind of lock them out, to keep money from being siphoned off into these private kind of black box situations where they're not providing the same infrastructure that we're trying to build. And what that means is, I mean, Nancy's specialty, like voting rights, like getting people access to ballots, but also improving like communication within communities. And I think, again, I kind of reiterate this a lot, like there is so much support for public schools already that it's just about connecting with these people. So making time. And I think that's the hard thing, is that it is a huge investment of time for people to kind of compete with that money. But once we start talking to folks in our neighborhoods and just saying the simple things over and over again about the value of public schools, they get it. The hard part is with the way that Republicans are dismantling our access to the ballot through citizen initiatives, as well as just voter suppression. It makes it really hard to influence the actual policymakers. So attacking voting rights issues, I think, is the key issue here.
Anything you want to add, Nancy?
Yeah, money in politics. That's how I sum up that question. And that is a challenge. And I think that this is where perhaps the grassroots organizing comes into play and becomes so critical, because there perhaps are some resources that we are not going to be able to contend with one for one. Most community organizations just simply are not going to be able to raise the funds and finance campaigns at the level of some of these major political action committees. But that should not mean, I hope, that they just give up and not engage. It means that we have to be more creative and strategic in terms of how we educate voters, how we turn out the vote, and perhaps being even more successful in terms of the level in which voters engage. So again, I think that's important, and there's actually legislation, HR 1, the For the People Act, that's been introduced in Congress to deal with money in politics. But until we get there, I think we have to come up with some plan Bs and plan Cs. And part of that is just going to be hitting the streets. And as Charles said earlier, we've got to start interfacing, post-COVID, or how we deal with COVID. We've got to start interfacing with voters directly to shortcut what that money influence can do.
And one small thing, like I know the money thing can be very difficult because like it doesn't always feel like both sides have the same kind of bankroll, but it's important to pay people that are doing this work in the States. I mean, having been on both sides now, there's a huge disparity in the income that activists can earn working on a pro-democracy, progressive side versus what you can make on the other side. And I think that like keeping good people who are effective with institutional knowledge that can like really build on things like passion is important, but like at a certain point, like we live in a society where they have to pay their bills. And so paying good people, like good money, will be important for the organizations, I think.
So, yeah, I mean, and, you know, I would say it's axiomatic to say, you know, they have the money, we have the people, but it's also true. There is truth in it. I mean, they have people too. They've got these grassroots crazies that are filling school board meetings with, you know, about critical race theory. But, you know, but there's kind of no shortcut to talking to people and engaging people. It's only a question of how much you do. So I'm just looking at the clock, a couple more questions. So one is, in Missouri, my representative claims to support vouchers because it will help children in at-risk areas. What's the best way to respond? Who wants to go first? Charles? Nancy?
Yeah, I can like touch on that a little bit. One of the things that we look at is like pretty much anywhere a voucher program has been implemented, you kind of have a couple things. Either they start off small and they say they just want to help one specific group. And once they've got the program in place, it's incrementalism all the way until you have a universal voucher system. So no matter how targeted they want to make it, the goal is always to leverage, like just getting the foot in the door and then pushing it wider and wider so that it forms as an entire subsidy to privatization across the board. And really what we see is that these programs don't actually really provide a lot of benefits for these students. I mean, anytime you look at the academic outcomes for different students, they're just lacking. They aren't there. And usually if there are academic gains found in school choice programs, they've accrued to students who've remained in public schools after a privatization program has been put into place. One of the things I would also say is that students who have needs, it's unfortunate that our public schools have been attacked and gutted to the point where it's difficult for them to serve students as well as they can and could. So I think the best place to do is to focus on helping those people find the resources they need within their public schools. But if you look around, if a person's in like a risk area, like they're probably not going to have many options that are actually feasible, even with some of these voucher programs. A lot of them don't cover enough of the tuition, they don't cover transportation costs, they don't cover meals, might be school uniforms. There's lots of exclusionary ways that these private schools and even charter schools manipulate enrollment processes and other things to keep out high-risk students who are going to be harder to educate, more expensive to educate. At the end of the day, their goal is to make a profit off of the students. So if they're taking in really hard to educate students for a low fee, it's just not going to be a viable business model. So it's just not a system that's designed to help high-risk, high-need students.
Nancy, I'm not going to go to you for that question because I want to shift to the Supreme Court, back to the court case again. We have one specific question, you've probably seen it as well, is just about whether the Supreme Court issue was only applicable to Arizona right now, but I want to broaden that to say, given what looks like a terrible Supreme Court on the issue of voting rights, is the door closed now to challenges to voting rights restrictions around the country? And if you're in the middle of it, what are your thoughts?
So the answer to your question, Donald, I would say is no, because we are not going out of business when it comes to advocating for protection and expansion of voting rights, and we will continue to use the constitutional and statutory tools that Congress and the states have erected to protect those rights. What I will say in terms of answering the question is that no, the court's ruling arguably does not apply only to Arizona, because the issues presented were wrapped around Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, a federal law that prohibits the denial or dilution of voting rights based on race, color, national origin. And the court decided not to apply that provision of the Voting Rights Act to the laws at issue in Arizona, which specifically involved, again, as I said in my opening remarks, what we call out of precinct voting and assistance in terms of ballot collection. Now, I think what the court's decision does allow for is evidence of showing how impactful those kinds of laws are. It seemed that the court was not convinced that the statistics related to the number of voters who would be impacted was large enough to justify striking down those laws. But we know for sure, even though we don't have the data right now, we know that those kinds of laws disparately impact communities of color. And we know that we already had problems getting folks out to vote. So we can look at the suppression, I would argue, would apply to that category of voter too, who's already facing challenges for whatever reason when it comes to getting to the ballot box or wanting to be engaged in the first place. So again, I would say that we will continue to challenge voting rights restrictions. We will continue to use the Voting Rights Act in Section 2, which was specifically at issue in the case before the Supreme Court, and we will do our best to narrow the Supreme Court's decision so that we can at least have some semblance of democracy, which is what we're talking about today.
Okay, these are crazy times. I want to answer just one question that was sort of a technical question from Rick about charter schools. I hear the term, quote, public charter school versus, quote, private charter school. What defines the difference? What's the difference between public versus private? I think there are a few charter schools that are run by school districts, so I want to take those away that that are really part of the public school system. They're run by the district, but I think in the end it's really definite. It's really just because people are not using precise language. Every charter school, other than that small category I just mentioned, are privately operated schools funded by the public. Some are run by nonprofits, some are run by nonprofits and then hire, then where they hire a for-profit to manage it. Some are run by for-profits, but they're all privately run with their own private boards, but they're all publicly funded. So I'm gonna hand it back to Jessica. I don't think we have enough time for another question. Jess, you're on.
I wish we had time for more of these outstanding questions, but thank you to everybody in the audience who submitted such thought-provoking questions and comments. And please feel free to email us if you want to get in touch with the panelists or want more information about any of these topics. We'll be happy to provide it. You can email us at info@pfps.org. But right now, I want to thank so much our panelists, Southern Poverty Law Center's Nancy Abudu and public education consultant Charles Siler, and of course, our moderator, Donald Cohen from In the Public Interest. We are so appreciative of you taking time during this very busy year to share your expertise with us and your passion for these issues with us. And we thank everybody for joining us. So please sign up for PFPS updates to get information about our next webinar and our upcoming advocacy and other events, and wish everyone a very nice and restful holiday weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.